Welcome to Chronicles of Old Tales. In the sprawling, opulent world of 19th century China, the rules were etched in stone, immutable and absolute. Men held the dominion, and women were but shadows in the grand theater of power. So, when the weary Xianfeng Emperor breathed his last in the autumn of 1861, his final decree seemed a perfect reflection of this timeless order. He entrusted the future of the teetering Qing Dynasty to a council of 8 of the most powerful and conservative men in the empire, a regency of iron-willed ministers and princes. To them, and to the world, it was the only logical course of action. In their formidable calculus, the emperor's young concubine, a woman known as Cixi, was a mere footnote. She was an accessory, the grieving, powerless mother of the new 5-year-old emperor. They saw her as a beautiful ornament, destined to live out her days in the secluded luxury of the inner palace, politically irrelevant. But in their arrogance, they committed a monumental, dynasty-altering blunder. They underestimated the woman in the gilded cage. While the 8 regents, led by the formidable Su Sun, were posturing, consolidating their authority, and jealously guarding their new power, Cixi was moving in the shadows. Far from grieving, she was calculating. Far from being powerless, she was quietly forging a network of unlikely allies, exploiting the grievances and ambitions of those, like her, who had been cast aside. She was setting a political trap of breathtaking brilliance and audacity. This is the story of how a woman with no formal authority, no army, and no political standing, armed with only her intellect and an intimate understanding of the court's hidden rivalries, outmaneuvered the 8 most powerful men in China. It's the story of how she orchestrated a bloodless coup and seized control of an empire on the brink of collapse. Long before history would know her as the formidable Empress Dowager Cixi, a name that would echo with power and controversy for decades, she was simply a girl named Yahenira. Born into a distinguished but not particularly powerful Manchu family, her fate was decided at the age of 16 when she was selected from a pool of candidates to enter the Forbidden City. This was presented as the highest of honors, a pathway to glory. In reality, it was a life sentence in the most beautiful prison on earth. She became one of hundreds of concubines, women whose entire existence was a competition for the attention and favor of a single man, the Xianfeng Emperor. In the palace's meticulously kept records, she was stripped of her identity, referred to only as the woman of the Nala family. Life was a suffocating routine of ritual and etiquette, a world of silent, vicious rivalries where a misplaced word or a moment of imperial favor could be the difference between a life of quiet luxury and one of utter obscurity. While this gilded cage enforced its serene and deadly order, the world outside its towering vermilion walls was violently tearing itself apart. The Qing Dynasty, once the undisputed hegemon of Asia, was in a state of advanced decay. The treasury was being bled dry by the gargantuan Taiping Rebellion, a cataclysmic civil war that raged across the south. Led by a man who claimed to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ, this rebellion was not just an uprising, but a total war against the Qing state and its Confucian foundations, eventually claiming the lives of an estimated 20 million people. As if this internal rot wasn't enough, the empire was being hammered from the outside. During the Second Opium War, British and French forces, seeking to expand their trading rights, marched on Beijing itself. They looted and burned the magnificent old summer palace, an act of such profound vandalism that it shattered the emperor's spirit. Broken and humiliated at having to flee his own capital, the Xianfeng emperor essentially gave up. He retreated to his summer palace in Rihe, seeking solace in wine, theater, and opium, allowing his health to collapse under the weight of his despair. And it was in this crucible of imperial decline that Cixi's unlikely ascent began. She was exceptionally intelligent, possessing a sharp political mind. Crucially, and unlike the vast majority of women at court who were kept illiterate, Cixi could read and write Chinese. As the emperor's health failed, he became increasingly reliant on her. His hands trembled, his eyes grew weak, and so he began to ask her to read his daily state memorials and documents aloud. Soon, he was not just listening, he was asking for her opinion. He began instructing her on the proper responses, having her draft the edicts, and, eventually, stamp the papers with his official vermilion pen. While the court officials and rival concubines saw only a consort attending to her ailing master, Cixi was receiving a masterclass in the art of governance. She was learning the intricate machinery of power, the flow of information, the kingdom of secrets, and the messy, brutal business of politics directly from the heart of the empire. Then, in April of 1856, the political calculus of the entire Forbidden City was upended. Cixi gave birth to a son, Zichuan. He was not just any son. In a court filled with daughters and childless consorts, he was the emperor's only surviving son and heir. Her status skyrocketed overnight. She was elevated from a mid-level concubine to noble consortee. She was no longer an expendable palace fixture. She was the biological mother of the dynasty's future. This birth did not grant her any legitimate political power, as Qing tradition strictly forbade women from governing. But it made her indispensable. It also, however, painted a giant target on her back. The powerful, conservative Manchu nobles at court, who already viewed her intelligence and influence with suspicion, now saw her as a potential long-term rival, a mother who might try to rule through her son, a threat that, sooner or later, would have to be neutralized. In the sweltering heat of August 1861, at the Imperial Mountain Resort in Rihe, the Xianfeng Emperor finally succumbed to his illnesses and despair. He was just 30 years old. He left behind a fractured, bleeding empire and a 5-year-old son, Zichuan, to inherit it. A power vacuum in an empire is a terrifying thing, and this one was immense, threatening to swallow what was left of the Qing dynasty. In his final, lucid moments, the emperor made a decision he believed would secure the throne. He appointed a council of 8 regents to rule until his son came of age. These were not just any officials. They were the absolute cream of the Manchu conservative elite, a powerful clique led by the iron-fisted imperial relative, Susan. Susan and his 7 allies were arch-traditionalists, men who embodied the old guard of the Manchu aristocracy. They were deeply xenophobic, contemptuous of the barbarian Westerners who had humiliated them, and equally disdainful of the Han Chinese officials they believed were diluting the purity of Manchu rule. Above all, they deeply, profoundly distrusted Cixi. In their rigid, patriarchal worldview, a woman's place was in the inner quarters, confined to domestic duties, completely isolated from the world of politics. The foundational tenets of the Qing dynasty were explicit: women do not govern. To them, Cixi was a meddlesome concubine who had gotten too close to power, and now that the emperor was dead, she and the senior empress, Xian, were to be respectfully sidelined and rendered powerless. The 8 regents held the ministries, the armies, and the state treasury. They believed they had absolute control. But the dying emperor, in a moment of either shrewd foresight or simple adherence to protocol, had made one last, curious move. It's unclear whether he intended to deliberately check the regent's power or if he was simply following tradition, but he split the ultimate symbols of imperial authority. He decreed that the Council of 8 would have the power of the brush, the authority to draft and write all imperial edicts in the new emperor's name. But for any of those edicts to become law, they required the validation of 2 imperial seals. One seal, representing the emperor's authority, was given to the 8 regents. The other, a seal representing the emperor himself, was given jointly to the 2 highest-ranking women, the official Empress Dowager Cixi and Cixi, the boy emperor's mother. The regents, blinded by their own arrogance and centuries of tradition, likely saw this as a meaningless, sentimental gesture. How could 2 women, sequestered in the Forbidden City and legally barred from political life, ever hope to challenge them? They had the armies, the bureaucracy, the political connections, and the full weight of tradition on their side. The seals were just rubber stamps, a formality. But in this, they made the classic, fatal mistake of the arrogant. They utterly underestimated their opponent. Cixi, having spent years at the very center of political life, understood immediately what those seals represented. They were not a token of respect. They were a weapon in waiting. Confined to the imperial residence at Rihe, miles from the capital, Cixi understood her situation with chilling clarity. She and her young son were not just being ignored, they were prisoners of the regency. Susan and his allies viewed her as a lingering problem from the previous reign, a dangerous variable that needed to be controlled or, if necessary, eliminated. History was replete with grim tales of regents deposing or killing a young emperor's ambitious mother to secure their own power. If she was going to survive, let alone win the war for her son's throne, she could not do it alone. She needed powerful allies, and she needed them immediately. Her first and most essential ally was right by her side, sharing her gilded prison, the senior Empress Dowager Cixi. As the Xianfeng Emperor's principal wife, Cixi held a higher rank than Cixi. She was known to be quiet, virtuous, and generally uninterested in the cut and thrust of politics. However, she was deeply offended by the blatant arrogance and disrespect of Sussun and the regents, who treated her and Cixi like decorative relics. Cixi, a master of personal politics, began to cultivate this resentment, convincing the senior empress that their fates were intertwined. She argued that they were in this together. If the regents succeeded in isolating and silencing one of them, the other would inevitably be next. United, they possessed the legitimizing power of the imperial seals. Divided, they were helpless widows at the mercy of their enemies. Cixi, fed up with the regent's contempt for her authority and the memory of her late husband, agreed to the alliance. Their partnership was now sealed. But two women with a pair of stamps were still no match for 8 powerful men who commanded the state. They needed an ally with military connections and serious political influence, someone on the outside who could act for them. They found the perfect candidate in Prince Gong, the late emperor's own half-brother. Prince Gong was widely regarded as the most capable and intelligent of the imperial princes. He was ambitious and reform-minded, but he had been deliberately excluded from the Regency Council by Sussun and his conservative faction. They distrusted his pragmatic approach and his experience negotiating with Western powers, the very experience that had forced him to see the necessity of modernization. While the court fled, Prince Gong had been the one left behind in Beijing to clean up the mess and make peace with the British and French, a humiliating task that earned him the scorn of hardliners like Sussun. Prince Gong was bitter, resentful, and sidelined, yet he remained one of the most respected figures in the imperial clan, the perfect person to lead a counterstrike. Cixi began sending secret messages to him from the seclusion of the Rihe Palace, likely using trusted eunuchs as couriers. While the 8 regents were completely preoccupied with the elaborate, slow-moving, and minutely detailed funeral arrangements for the late emperor, Cixi and Prince Gong were meticulously plotting a coup. Secret notes were smuggled between the mountain resort and the capital. A plan was hatched, supporters were quietly sounded out, and alliances were formed with other military leaders and officials who had been similarly marginalized by Sussun's clique. The regents were so confident in their authority, so wrapped up in the pageantry of their new power, they remained completely oblivious. They never saw the trap being laid for them. The plan conceived by Cixi and Prince Gong was a masterwork of political stagecraft, exploiting the regents' arrogance and their slavish devotion to tradition. The entire plot hinged on the grand imperial funeral procession, the slow, formal, and sacred journey to transport the Xianfeng Emperor's coffin from the mountain resort of Rihe back to the capital, Beijing. As regents, Sussun and his council were ritually bound to accompany the coffin every step of the way. Their leader, Sussun himself, was designated as the personal escort for the sacred bier. This solemn duty would trap them on the road for weeks, isolating them from their base of power in the capital. This was the precise moment of vulnerability Cixi had been waiting for. Playing the part of a delicate, concerned mother, she made a formal petition to the regency. She argued that the long, arduous journey over rough terrain would be too strenuous for her 5-year-old son, the new emperor. For the sake of his fragile health, she requested that she, Empress Dowager Cixi, and the young emperor be allowed to travel ahead by a faster, more direct route to Beijing. The regents, likely relieved to have the troublesome women and the boy emperor out of their hair, readily agreed. In a move of spectacular folly, they even sent 2 of their own members, Ziyuan and Duanhua, to escort the empresses, effectively splitting their own forces. Cixi's move was strategically brilliant. While Sussun and the core of his allies were trapped in the ponderous, ritualistic funeral procession, inching their way towards the capital, Cixi was racing ahead. She, Cixi, and the child emperor arrived in Beijing days ahead of schedule. There, they were met immediately by Prince Gong, who had been busy preparing the ground. The trap was now set. With the emperor and the 2 empresses physically present in the capital, Prince Gong now possessed the ultimate political legitimacy. He had already secured the loyalty of the commander of the Beijing garrison, ensuring he had the necessary military force to back his play. Together, Cixi and Prince Gong drafted a blistering memorial, a document that would be their primary weapon. In the name of the child emperor, they accused the 8 regents of treason, of forging the late emperor's will to usurp power, and of gross incompetence in their dealings with the Western powers. They had the charges, they had the army, and most critically, they had the imperial seals required to make their edicts the undeniable law of the land. When the regents' procession finally, leisurely, made its way into Beijing, they were not entering a city that hailed them as its masters. They were walking into a perfectly executed ambush. One by one, they were summoned to the Forbidden City for an audience with the emperor. Stunned and completely unprepared, they were arrested on the spot. Before they could even comprehend what was happening, it was all over. The bloodless Xinyo Coup, as it came to be known, was a stunning and complete success. If you find the stories of history's great political masterminds as fascinating as we do here at Chronicles of Old Tales, make sure you subscribe and ring that notification bell. We have many more stories of intrigue and power to share. And let us know in the comments. Do you see Cixi as a brilliant savior who rescued the dynasty from a group of incompetent conservatives? Or was she a ruthless opportunist who seized power for herself? In the immediate aftermath of the coup, events moved with breathtaking speed. Cixi and Prince Gong had won a total victory, and now they moved decisively to consolidate their power. Of the 8 regents, the 3 most powerful were singled out to be made a stark example of. Prince Gong, still burning with resentment, argued for the death by 1,000 cuts, the most excruciating form of execution reserved for the worst traitors. But Cixi, already thinking about public perception and the stability of her new regime, overruled him. Su Sun, the ringleader, was taken to a public market and beheaded, a swift, clean death deemed appropriate for a soldier. The other 2 principal regents, Ziyuan and Duanhua, were granted the honor of committing suicide in private with silk scarves sent to their cells. The remaining 5 regents were stripped of their titles and positions, some sent into remote exile, effectively ending their careers but sparing their lives. Then, in a stroke of political genius, Cixi broke sharply with tradition. She issued an edict declaring that the families of the executed regents would be spared. This calculated act of clemency was designed to showcase her as a firm but magnanimous ruler, not a bloodthirsty tyrant, a move that helped pacify the nervous imperial bureaucracy. On November 12, 1861, a formal imperial edict was issued in the name of the child emperor, now given the new reign name Tongji, meaning collective rule. The edict officially stripped the 8 regents of all authority and, in a revolutionary break with dynastic law, named Cixi and Xian as co-regents, the supreme rulers of the empire. Prince Gong was appointed as their prince regent and chief advisor. A new era had dawned, born from a brilliant conspiracy. A low-ranking concubine, a woman who had entered the Forbidden City with nothing but her wits, was now the de facto ruler of China. She began her political life with no army, no official title, and with the full force of tradition arrayed against her. But she had expertly used the few tools she possessed: her sharp intellect, her intimate knowledge of court politics, her enemy's fatal arrogance, and one perfectly planned, flawlessly executed trap. It was the beginning of a reign that would last for nearly 50 years, a reign that began with the Tongji Restoration and would see Empress Dowager Cixi become one of the most powerful, influential, and controversial women in the annals of world history.